Thank you. Thank you, and thanks to all the staff of the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers that made this happen, and all of our members who are here in the room that recommended that we work together on this, and all of you guys for taking time out of your super busy schedules to pause and reflect and think about how to improve your grant making as we move forward. So just a quick summary about peak grant making. Make sure I've got all of my technology working. Working, go forward. Oh, here, try it now. Perfect. All right, so peak grant making, as you just heard, is a community of 3,800 grant makers. Actually, we just clicked over to more than 4,000 grant makers across the country and around the world coming together to improve how grants get made. So it's all of the policies and procedures and practices and data and risk management, and you just think it would be a lot easier to give money away than it actually is, and you guys know that from what you're doing. So we provide a whole bunch of resources with and through and for grant makers, including an annual conference. We've got some information on your tables if you're interested in that. A very active online community, regional chapters, knowledge base, guides and resources, and particularly for this conversation on walking the talk, there's workbooks on every table, so I hope you'll need to grab one to fully participate in the workshop. And at the back, there's links and information to how you can get all of the materials and the slides and the information. So, so there'll be time for reflection, time to take notes, but hopefully we'll also leave you with a whole bunch of resources as you leave the room. And you'll notice before that very last page in your workbook is an action plan. So we hope everybody in this room comes out with some specific ideas on how to improve your practices moving forward. So let's jump in. I want to make this very interactive, and also we have this wonderful spread and all these beverages, so come and go and get what you need. We don't have to make this very formal. I'll do some talking at you, but hopefully you'll do a lot more talking with and amongst yourselves, because you guys are the experts in this, and that's where the fun comes, in learning from each other. So let's jump in. We believe that effective grant makers have values and align their practices with their values. And so every grant making organization has values. Some have explicit values or value statements. How many people have sort of an explicit statement of values for your organization? And for those that don't, think about the words you hear a lot among your staff and among your board. Think about the kinds of things that rises to the top when you're making grant decisions or when you're talking about your success or your effectiveness. You have values, they're there. They might be implicit, but they're there. And so we've been doing some field research to figure out what's happening in philanthropy in terms of values and aligning values with practices. I'll share that with you. And give you some tools for figuring out whether your values are aligned with your practices and how to make change in your organization. And values can be a really effective both lens and lever. So a lens to look at how you're making your grants in a different way and thinking about whether you're doing it the way that you intend. And then if you find areas where you think you can improve or can be more consistent with who you are and how you're acting, it can be a lever to advocate for change and to have those conversations in your organization about changing how you make your grants, maybe in a way that you hadn't before. So think about this conversation in those two. Can it be a diagnostic tool for making sure that you're walking the talk? And then can it help you figure out change in your organization? And so we hope that you'll leave this workshop believing as passionately as I do that aligning values and practices matter, with tools to help you align your values and your practices, and help give you some tools to get your colleagues on board, get staff, get boards on board, because nobody works in a silo, nobody works in a vacuum, and so there's other people that you're going to have to engage in this conversation around values and practices. And unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about storytelling. I should have taken that off, but we could cover that in a future webinar. Just to make sure we're on the same page, values are really the fundamental beliefs of an organization, and they should dictate how that organization and the people within it act. That's what we mean when we're talking about values. practices are the steps funders take to effectively, efficiently, and equitably mobilize your resources. So this is the how of your grant making. In a certain sense, it's the actual making of the grant. And it's the area, I would say, is least focused on by most grant makers over sort of strategy and relationships. But it's important because it's the most visible evidence of who you are as an organization. It's the requirements and how you interact with your grant seekers and your grantees is the most visible evidence of who you are as an organization, the most visible evidence of your values. And if your values and your practices aren't aligned, it can really damage your reputation as a funder and really make it very difficult for you to form true trusted relationships with your grant seekers and your grantees. So what is going on in the field in terms of values and practices? So we did a field survey, and from all of the people that responded, about 75% of funders said that they have explicit values. So we saw maybe about 50% just from eyeballing the room among New Jersey grant makers. So somewhat in line. And then for those that have values, about 75% of those said that they've actively tried to align their values and their practices. So you can see there's a big gap between, all the funders in the world and the groups that are actually trying to align their values and their practices. So we think there's a lot of opportunity for us as grant makers to work in this area, because grant makers also say foundations are more effective when their values and practices are aligned. And when we said, well, how do you think you're more effective? What experiences have you had? The top one was more consistent and strategic decision making by board and staff. Well, that's a really good thing to do. Sorry, these are a little bit out of order, but the second one was better relationship with grant seekers. Well, that's a thing that we want, isn't it? And along with more efficient application reporting practices and other results. So better relationships, potentially better outcomes for your grants. And these are what grant makers are saying about why it matters to them. Just a word cloud of the more common things. You can see transparency, values, trust, partnerships, about what the words grant makers use about why alignment matters. But when we ask grant makers to rate themselves on how well they're doing in aligning their values with their practices, they graded themselves C's and below. So again, lots of opportunity for us to really spend some time thinking about how do we align how we're making our grants better with who we are. And I know I'm talking kind of at a general level right now, but we'll get into much more specifics and examples about what this looks like and what this actually is. We did also ask grant makers what their values are. And this is, I think, in page 2 of your workbook. There's a longer explanation. So these were the most common values that grant makers reported. Certainly grant makers have other values out there, but these were the ones that were most common. So as we're going through the workshop, if your organization doesn't have explicit values, you could pull maybe on some of these as you're working through some of the exercises. Does anybody have values that aren't shown up here that they'd like to share? Yes. Flexibility. Good.
Authentic relationships.
Authentic relationships. Yes.
Seeking lasting change.
Lasting change. Seeking lasting change. Oh, that's a tough one. That's a good. That's a good one, but that's a good. Perfect. So again, we're not saying what values you should have. We're just saying whatever values you hold, how is it showing up? Is it matching who you say you are with actually what you're doing? So this could be a tool if you need to explore and you want to lift up some explicit values in your organization, or just information about what your colleagues and other funders are thinking and doing. So not these are the values you should have kind of conversation. So that's why values are important. Now let's look at how do you know if your practices are aligned with your values? So we've got a scenario. I should have a copy of a workbook here that starts on page Oh, actually, let's work together to do an example of exploring alignment. So on page 4, there's a sample kind of chart that we can use. So what value do you think together we want to kind of explore a little bit together? So we're going to pick one of these values and then together talk about how it shows up when it's aligned and how it might show up when it's misaligned. Collaboration, perfect. Partnerships, teamwork, working together. It might be the authentic relationships. However you are thinking about that in your organization. So some of the dimensions of practice we listed here, but we don't have to be wedded to it. So if your value is collaboration, how might you set your eligibility policies, who can apply, who you give grants to, that reflect that value of collaboration? Yes. So they have to be collaborating in order to get funding from you. How else might it show up?
We request that their programs support women and girls.
Got it. And who they're supporting. If you're collaborative with an organization, what might your grant application requirements look like? Yes.
Excuse me. We require, again, we award to collaborations with a league, one budget, and we require that all of the collaborating agencies sign off on it. Their board, the chairperson of their board signs, as well as the executive director and the program manager sign off on it.
So that they're all in alignment as they're coming to you. Could there be other ways that partnerships and collaboration could show up? What about if you have a disconnect or a misalignment? What might you see in applications when someone says that they want to collaborate, but then they actually don't?
Well, when you go on the site visit and they're introducing themselves to each other.
Yes. Yeah, for example, any practices, yes.
I think also you should find places on their website, places in the way they describe their programs that talk about their collaborators and where it's very obvious that they couldn't have the outcome that they have without true collaboration.
Right. So they're not just making it up for you because that's your value, but it's really core to who they are. That's here. Yes.
Are we talking about values that the foundation itself has?
Yes.
So, as opposed to what we're requiring of our grantees? I mean, I think it's two different questions.
Right.
When we talk about something like respect, or, right now everyone's just answering in terms of what they're making their grantees do. It's not really what they're talking about as a core value of the foundation.
Yep, that's a great point. Does somebody you had an example of? Right.
What I notice is the budget. If they say they're collaborating and then you look at the budget and what they've essentially done is split the pie and they're not really collaborating to produce the result, the budget is a big giveaway.
Yes.
Well, I think there's another type of collaboration, which would be collaboration among foundations.
Yes.
And one of the tensions around that is foundations feeling like we have to be the initiator of the effort and not helping to co-create that effort either with other foundations or with grantees, and this kind of, sometimes there's secrecy involved, which I don't quite get. I've been doing this for 25 years, I still don't get it, but, this kind of, I think there can be alignment and there can be misalignment among foundations, and also how open we are to having a conversation with potential grantees rather than it be you submit a proposal and we act on it.
Right.
Be collaboratively developing.
Right. And so you could see some of the practices if you are aligning your value of partnership and collaboration It could be starting with conversations, not with paperwork and proposals. It could be accepting applications, common applications or applications even written for other funders. If it could be working with the other funders of that organization to look at reporting requirements, timelines, things like that, so that you really are collaborating with and for and on behalf of the grantee, and transparent. And I think maybe what you're getting at a little bit too is sharing information and being as transparent as possible across all of the people that are part of that partnership to build those relationships.
I was just going to say, if you're talking about collaboration, another thing is the networking you might do as you might have a grantee or talk to them, and linking them up with other agencies and organizations within the community so that everybody has greater impact.
Yep.
So that's your value system as well to help the broader community.
Yeah, and this all takes time to build real partnerships, real collaborations. So what are the length of your grants? Are you only making project grants and being extremely specific and with a lot of limitations on what that money could be used for or how it could be moved around? Those are other sort of ways that you might be misaligned with saying we're a partner, but yet we're actually not working with you on this. We're imposing a number of things. We had a comment.
So I just wanted to say also with regard to collaboration, a mission, a common mission for that collaboration as well. So it's, not just each individual agency's mission, but the mission for the collaboration and what they plan on doing together.
Yeah.
And so one of the other things we do at our foundation, we vet those collaborators as well before they even submit an application to see if they're in line. Just because, a lead agency might say, I work with this person, we want to see that as well. So.
Yeah. Comment over here.
Yeah, one thing that, I'm in the Bell Fund for the Blind, but one of the things that has always been a challenge for us is we tell people what type of grants we'll make, okay? We give them examples, okay? One thing I'm trying to do, something that Carol Skirlo does, and says, listen, you must apply by this, your response will be, by a particular date. We give them predictability, so if we don't make a grant, they can go on to somebody else. We also make them indicate, are they applying for the exact same funding with anybody else, just so that we know fully what's going on. But I'm going to ask you a quick question.
No.
Is there software that's commonly used that you can basically get the people to say, listen, you acknowledge this is what our mission is, and actually fill it in so that there is a standardization. They know when they've actually pushed the button, that they've made the request, and you don't get all these phone calls, did you receive it, who was it sent to, et cetera?
Sure. There's actually a number of grants management software systems that work for large groups, small groups, all different kinds. We have a consumer's guide to grants management software that you can find on our website, or I can send you the link to it, that reviews all the different softwares, looks at kind of who uses them and the pros and cons. So there's a ton of great programs out there that can help you do that and automate things like acknowledgements, and like we got your proposal, here's what's happening, can automate things like grant agreements, can send reporting reminders, all that kind of stuff, so that you can focus your time on some of the more value-added work of grant making rather than the administration.
I was just going to say that I think that that's one of the values of membership in the Council of New Jersey Grantmakers, because by going to the workshops and so on,
Good cheerleader champion.
other grantmakers who may share similar areas of interest with folks, because we all know that we can't fund an entire project, and we need collaboration with grantmakers.
Yeah.
To make it happen. But we need to know each other in order to know who to approach.
Mm-hmm. And that might be another way where collaboration and partnership, where you live your values, is recognizing and acknowledging that you're just one part of what's happening at the organization. And so how much can you really expect from the organization in terms of requirements, in terms of reporting, and really think about, what's the right size of the requirements we put on our grantees and grant seekers, given the level of funding. Not the size of the grant, whether it's large or small to us, but whether it's large or small to the grantee or grant seeker. So looking at the grants you make as a proportion of their budget, and then using that as maybe a way to look at, does it really make sense to require quarterly reports when you're just a small part of what they're doing, for example. Great, so that was just kind of a brainstorming exercise that you can use in your own organizations to say, this is a value we hold. How is it showing up in what we're doing? How could it show up in what we're doing? So we created a scenario that we can work through, and you'll find it starting on page 5 or 6. So I'd like to ask you guys to take a couple minutes to read that at your tables. And then on page 7, there's a couple of questions that as you're reading it, ask yourselves, what alignments do you see in this story between the values and practices of the funder? The story is told from the perspective of the grant seeker, but answer this from the perspective of the funder. What is the grant seeker seeing as the alignments? And then what are the disconnects you see between who the funder says they are and what they're actually doing? And then when it seems like your tables kind of got done jotting their notes down, talk about it and share kind of what you saw as the alignment and the disconnects. Okay, does somebody want to call out an example of where you saw an alignment? I know that was a tough one. Anybody find one?
We said it benefits the region, the community development.
That the work, hi. You guys will have more time to talk to each other, I promise, in just a minute. Great, so we did find a group that did find one alignment, which is the work did benefit the region. Anybody else find an alignment?
Collaboration, they state both that they're collaborating, that they believe in that, to work together.
Yeah. So, but then did you think that the grant seeker felt collaborated with?
Oh, no,
yeah,
no.
that was a disconnect. Yeah, the disconnects.
I just have a comment.
Yes.
If someone's asking a question, it's kind of hard to hear. Can you just repeat it?
Oh, yes. Yes, I will do that. Thank you. Thank you. So we went into the disconnects, and it was brought up that the funder says that they collaborate, but that was not the experience of the grant seeker in this example. Anybody else come up with a disconnect? Yes?
I thought it was a long period of time before they were given any notice whether they received a grant or not, and that often puts the grantee in a turmoil.
Yeah.
They're not sure what's happening.
Yeah. So a long period of time to get an answer, and the grant seekers left in turmoil, not knowing what's going on, not being able to move forward. Those are great examples. So now let's turn the attention to what's going on in your organization. So there's a work page on page 8, an opportunity to list the examples of where your organization aligns with your values and practices. Let me just give you a couple examples from colleague organizations to help you think about this. So the Bush Foundation's in Minnesota, and they have a value of customer service, that they look at their work as being in service to their grant seekers. And so they took a hard look at their reporting requirements and eliminated a lot of the paper and turned to their staff talking to their grant seekers and found that they were able to learn a lot more. And then when they do ask for the grant seekers to write things down, it's very much in the service of what did you learn that could be helpful to others doing the work that you're doing? And then they are working to get those lessons learned out there in the world. So if you go to their website, you'll find a section where they're getting those learnings out there so that they can be used by others. So that's an example of how they're walking the talk in their work. The Weingart Foundation is in Los Angeles, and they have a value of communicating with transparency. So they've decided to go out frequently and have meetings with their communities, so beyond their grant seekers, to listen and learn. And then whatever they hear, they take and reflect back and share. So the good news and the bad news about the work that they're doing as a funder and what they're hearing and learning, and how they're going to act and react to it too. So that's how they're living their value of communicating with transparency. So think about your values in your organization, again, staying rooted in who are you fundamentally as an organization, and how is that showing up in your practices? And take a few minutes to jot down some notes with that. Thank you guys so much. So I hope that maybe you got some ideas about hearing how your colleagues were living their values and their practices. And now let's continue with our scenario. So on page 9, we've got part 2. So it's the continuing saga of the ABC Foundation. So take a look, read the additional information, and then jot down some notes. How would you change the foundation's practices to better align with their values? And if you were in charge, could you just change these practices unilaterally? Or who else might you need to engage in that organization to make that change happen? And then how would you go about doing it? How might you initiate a broader organizational conversation around those changes? So read the scenario, jot down your notes on that, and then you'll get to talk to each other again real soon, I promise. So does anybody want to share what they talked about in terms of the changes that they'd make to this foundation's practices? What changes would you make to this foundation's practices? Yes?
Okay. So, what we talked about at our table was, one, just some really basic things like adding name and contact information on the website so you know who to talk to. Two, see people I haven't seen in a while. Yeah. Two, we talked about the possibility of, given how much they could fund, given how much they were requested, something like a letter of intent, much shorter, not as much work initially, so that there's some scan. Three, we talked about, even if it's on a revolving schedule, to have some set time that says within 2 weeks or within 3 weeks of receipt, someone from the foundation will contact you. And there was one other thing, which I forget now, does anybody remember?
Sample letter.
Right, yeah, some kind of samples possibly that kind of talk to more clearly what they fund, because there was a big disconnect between what was being proposed and what it seems they actually do fund.
Yeah, those are all excellent ideas. And we'll get to some of the things that were brought up before about how long it took to hear and what kind of limbo that puts the grant seekers in. So thank you. I think those are all excellent ways that this foundation could be walking the talk a bit better. How do you think that these changes would actually happen? Could just one person do it? Could you do it on your own? Or who would you need to engage in these conversations to change to a letter of inquiry process, for example?
I think that if you just want to clarify some information, timelines, deadlines, better clearly stating your funding priorities, that's an easy adoption to your website. I think that's pretty straightforward. And in terms of process, I don't know. I think it would probably might need to go, to the board to discuss that and how that needs to go. But at least clarifying the basic information is an easy process.
Yeah, and I think this is a great point about separating out, hey, the easy fixes, just sharing more information, let's do it, let's get it done, and then let's have more thoughtful conversations. And it just depends on how your organization works, right? Sometimes that is the realm of the staff that can just change practice. Sometimes the board's much more involved in how the grants get made, and then it's a larger conversation there. So perfect. So just more kind of practice and thinking through kind of how you identify what's wrong, what's the disconnects are between the values and practices, how would you fix it, and we'll get into, in the next step, how do you actually get people on board with change. But before we jump into that, turn to page 10. And again, these are your workbooks, private and special to you. So now reflect on, in your organization, for your values, are there areas of disconnect? Name the value, describe the practice. This is just for you, and hopefully might inform an action plan for you coming out of this. And then how would you change the practice to make it more aligned? And what would be different in how you would make your grants, and what you would need to be engaged, who would need to be engaged to make it happen? So take some time on your own to jot down your notes on page 10. So again, there might be somebody in the room that has a value of transparency or a value of learning that wants to or is comfortable sharing maybe an area of potential improvement. But I can share something from my background. The suspense, the suspense. I've got a story about an epic failure. Well, maybe not. I have stories about epic failure in my grant making, but so my background's in corporate philanthropy, and one of the implicit values in our corporate grant making was accessibility. We wanted the community to feel like they could come to us and make requests and have grants. So we had an open process. Anybody could apply. We had criteria and areas of focus, but it was open. But the reality was we were working on sort of long-term change, housing and community development, homelessness. And so we were funding the same partners year after year. So the actual number of new grantees that came in every year was minuscule. I'm talking, we probably made 2,000 grants a year, maybe 5 were new. I'm talking like the disparity in were new. And it took a long time to get change made in the organization and try to make that case for change, because there was this, but if we go to a solicited process where we just ask the people we want to fund to apply, we're going to be closed off. We're not going to have this accessibility. Once we finally got into that conversation about how we were really showing up in the world, and the fact that we were declining so many organizations was not making them feel like we were accessible. They felt like they were wasting their time, that we were actually wasting resources from the causes and organizations and communities that we were actually trying to fund and fix. And so once the board got into that conversation, we made the change pretty quickly. But that's just an example of where the intentions were good and the ideas were good, but when you really match it up against the reality of what we were doing, we weren't living our values, and we're actually doing more damage to us and the grantees than we'd understood.
So another value would be resources. So in your situation, if you had contacts with other people, other foundations that were funding, would you then refer or give it, share that information? Because then that would address your issue of people calling and you're saying, no, we're not funding, and then feeling. At least you give them some other resources.
So we pointed people towards the Foundation Center, but didn't have the capacity to sort of be their prospect researcher. In a lot of cases. So the question was, could you still live your value of accessibility in a different way that would actually be helpful to the grant seekers? For example, pointing them towards other funders that might be able to fund them if we weren't able to. So we also moved into making more multi-year grants, more operating support grants, all as a result of this conversation about what was really important to us. What was the real value here? Was it impact? Was it relationships? Was it accessibility? And we kind of dropped the accessibility in favor of some values that seem to make more sense and be more true to what we were trying to do in the world. So it's just an example of, and I would say that, we're all a work in progress. So I have not met a grant maker that didn't think that they could do better, that they wanted to do better, that they could improve their practices. So I think where a lot of the less than optimal practices come from are really, we're just moving too fast and we don't have the time to really stop and think things through or take the time to make change. And so don't feel discouraged if you do have, depending on how long your list is of ways that you might be misaligned or things that you might want to improve. Just think about it as an incremental kind of process, and we know change comes incrementally. So just pick one thing and start working on it to see if you can bring your values and practices more aligned. And I think you'll find your colleagues in the room are probably working on some similar things, or maybe different practices, but that same feeling of we can do better, we can be better, we can be better partners to our grant seekers and our grantees. We can be more transparent. to the world, maybe more even more transparent internally in your organizations too. So again, whatever your values are, I think there's always space to live them more fully. And so it gets into the conversation about, well, how do I know if my values are aligned? How do I know if I'm living my values, or how do I identify opportunities to improve? And so starting on page 11, we've put together some examples. And so what it really starts with is formulating a question. So based on what your values are, together in your organization, come up with a question. So in the example, if your value was around integrity, honesty, ethical behavior, a typical question you might ask yourselves is, how can we ensure that your decisions are ethically sound, less mysterious, consistent, and transparent to live that value? And then brainstorm. What does this look like? What does it look like to have our grant decisions be more transparent, live our value more fully? And so we've just, that brainstorming might result in ideas like the ones that are listed on page 11. So it's not, there's no sort of magical formula to this. It's just conversations. It's just sitting down and talking to others in your organization. First, coming to a shared understanding of what your values are and what they mean to you. Because as you can see in some of the values, like what is integrity could mean something different to different people. And so it's having those conversations about what does it mean to you and your organization, and then exploring how could it show up in our funding, in our practices, and then it's up to you to decide how you actually want to do it. So. And so the Hewlett Foundation in California, they have probably a ton more resources and capacity than a lot of people in this room, but they went through a process in their organization where they looked at this, where they said, here's our values, here's our practices, are they aligned, what's happening? And they have a great document where they put all of this down. The URL is on the back page of the workbook that you can access it. And I'd encourage you all to take a look at it, because they did a great job of talking about the process they went through to figure this out, and then they put it out there in the world. Here is how we live our values through our practices. And so you might not be able to do that same scope of a project in your organization, but it might help give you some ideas for how you might start to tackle and have those conversations. And again, what they did was just sit down and talk to each other, interview staff, interview board members, figure out where people were, and kind of come up with that consensus about what do our values mean to us, and then how do they need to show up in our practices. Another piece I want to point out around this whole conversation shows up, we have an example of it on page 14, because sometimes your values can be in conflict. So let's say you want to be a good steward of the resources that you have, right? You have a responsibility as a funder to make the best decisions you can, the best investments you can to change the world. But maybe you also want to be innovative and risk-taking and push the envelope and be that money that can come in where nobody else can. These two things can be in conflict a lot. And you might see it in conversations between your CFO and your program staff in terms of, kind of what perceived risk you might have in a particular grant or particular investment, and whether you decide to move forward with it. And those are some tricky waters to navigate. And again, just comes down to conversations about how do you want to show up and how do you want to live your values, and what does being a good steward mean in partnership with wanting to, I probably shouldn't use partnership because we're going to talk about that as value, but in connection to this idea of risk-taking and innovation. Does anybody have in their values, values that come into conflict that you guys have had conversations in your organizations about? Or have you seen them in other places?
I think you identified one of the big ones early on, and that is with innovation. We talk so much about innovation, and as you said, then we find ourselves funding funding the same groups over and over and over again, or we give them such short timelines that they can't really be innovative because they have to present outcomes too soon.
Yeah.
And, or, they're afraid that we're gonna defund them, or they get incredibly flowery in their description of their outcomes because they wanna make sure that they continue to get funding. So I think that we talk about innovation, and I've heard in other programs of a shifting from innovation to impact.
Yeah.
And that's something I'm thinking about.
Yeah. So it was for those if you weren't able to hear, I'm not going to be able to summarize. That was very well said, very well, but it was a reflection on how difficult innovation as a value is. If you're funding the same groups every year, or you're not making long enough grants to really see kind of innovation happen, I'd tack on to that asking a lot of questions for the organization to prove what they're doing is going to work, because that's not innovation. You don't know until you do it if it's going to work or not. So thank you. That was a great comment. You had a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say, recognizing that impact and change can take many years, but also looking for that annual outcome reporting that is showing some change, and kind of asking grantees to show change within sometimes a 10-month frame, but at the same time realizing that the outcomes of that project may be many years down the road.
Yeah. This is a big struggle, the desire for us as funders to see the impact of what we're funding, but the disconnect is the timeline at which we're making grants, which might be a year or less, and wanting to see some kind of movement. And how do you reconcile those kind of competing things in your work, and getting comfortable that that you're not going to really see impact for a very long time.
I mean, connected to that is also, it's so difficult to raise dollars for research and evaluation, and yet there is a real emphasis on impact and outcomes, and then the capacity building that goes along with that.
Yeah.
So I think that's a disconnect.
So there's a desire for the research and evaluation, but the dollars aren't there to fund it. More and more funders are asking for data, but they're not funding the capacity of organizations to collect that data. There's a lot of challenges in what we want to do and where we're going. But we got a lot of smart minds in this room that's going to figure this out. So moving forward, yes.
So this is a little more of a communications section than a grant-making section, but we have two guiding principles that sort of don't always play nice together. So one of them is stated, we seek bold and lasting change rooted in the best available evidence, analysis, and science, openly debated. And the other is we speak out as leaders for what we believe. And sort of when to speak versus when the science is ready for you to say as much as you would like to be able to say is a sort of a topic of constant debate. It's a good debate, actually. It's a healthy, and I think it's healthy to have sometimes principles that are tense with each other. But it's interesting.
This was a great example, correct me if I don't paraphrase it right, of two principles that are in tension with each other about wanting to do research and really understand the world, but then also wanting to be very vocal and out there and talking about what's happening. And so when is the research ready to talk about, when can you go out there and navigating that path? So great. Perfect. So that's so hopefully that's some tools for you guys to start diagnosing or figuring out if there's opportunities in your work to align your values with your practices. I'll head into some tools now that are around how do you build consensus in your organization for change. Some of these tools will be familiar to you. They're change management tools generally. They are very applicable also to your personal lives. So you may want to use it in multiple formats. But I'll run through these a little bit quickly, but there are guides and resources on our website where you can access these a little bit more fully. And we built this together with a group called the Consensus Building Institute that's really a superstar in this area. So what are the barriers to getting change made in your organization? Just shout them out. The board. I didn't hear the second one. Let's go with differing opinions about what should be changed. Money to make change. Time comes up a lot. I don't have time to work on this and figure it out and get everybody else on board. Building consensus takes a lot of time. Knowledge or skill set. What exactly do we need to change and how do we know? Risk. Oh, this is scary. Change is scary, scary, scary. I think you cover most of it. Disagreement on what to do. Maybe a leadership vacuum. Nobody's really kind of championing it along the way. Risk aversion, lack of collaboration. So there's lots of challenges to making any change in your organization, including working to align your practices more with your values. But we've got some tools that can help you build consensus more effectively in your organization. And here's what they are: advancing inquiry before advocacy, building coalitions, moving from positions, courageous conversations, and then making the case. So I'll run through these, like I said, kind of quickly. So what is engaging an inquiry? They aren't in the handout. On the very last page, there's a link to our website. There's some like pages and tools in the workbook that can help you advance this. So I'll point those out as we're kind of going through. The URL is on the back of your workbook. So it's this peakgrantmaking.org/walk the talk. It's the very first resource that's listed on the additional resources. So there's much more of an explanation, a guide, tools that you can bring into your organization and use, so you don't have to take sort of super extensive notes on this. So here's an example of engaging in inquiry before advocacy, which means ask questions before you start trying to make change happen. And so here's an example of why this matters. So, so this is a story. Turned out to be an urban legend, but for a while people thought it was true, of an interaction between the US and Canada. So it's a radio conversation between a naval ship and Canadian authorities. So the Americans say, you need to move, you're in our way. And the Canadians say, no, you need to move, you're in our way. And the Americans say, I am the captain of a US Navy ship, you move. And the Canadians say, probably very politely, no, you should move. And then, here we go. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Here's more information. I am advocating. I am the captain of the ship. We're a carrier. We are very large. We have all these other boats with us. You need to move. So they're advocating for the Canadians to move without asking a question. And so the Canadians answer, fine, this is a lighthouse, your call. And so it's a funny example of, if you had just asked, hey, Canadians, who are you? Why are you there? They would have said, oh, we're a lighthouse. You might want to not run into land. That conversation would have gone a lot easier. And so in this concept of inquiry before advocacy, it is asking those questions. And the less that you think you agree, that you start off in an area of agreement, the more that you need to understand each other. The more questions you need to ask to understand, what does a person think about the topic, in the context of what we're talking about this change in practice that you think needs to happen, this opportunity to align your values and your practices? It needs to start with respect. The other person's opinion, it comes from somewhere valid. Your opinion might be different, but it comes from somewhere valid. And so starting with respect. And then understanding what they think the impact of this change might be on them. And practicing strategic listening, listening with your heart and mind, listening to learn, testing for their intentions. And then expressing and testing your understanding. That's, I think, like I said, you've probably heard a lot of these tools and approaches before. Reflecting back to someone, I heard you say that you're concerned about blah. I heard you say that you think we should do this. And so that's what testing and reflecting back means in that. So ask all those questions, understand where the other person's coming from, and then you can craft your advocacy strategy. Then knowing where they're coming from, what they think should happen, what their concerns are, you can build your case. You can share what your perceptions of the facts and reasoning. You can test understanding as you go. You can come up with responses to their concerns. So I know you're concerned with this, here's how I would solve it. You can seek trade-offs and consider options that address both needs too. So it's just talking to people and listening is what it comes down to. But starting with the listening first before you start advocating for your position. And this will come up through some of these other tools too. And so once you understand where people in your organization are, you can start looking at how you can build coalitions for change. And so there's a map that you might have seen or used before where you can map people on the stakeholders. So who are the people that might have high support and high influence? Those might be board members. Where are there places where there might be low support and low influence? And so you take all your stakeholders and you put them on the map, and then you can design advocacy strategies for reaching them where they are. You might decide to ignore the low support, low influence people because they're not going to help kind of lead to the action that you want, and focus on the high influence, high support. And you might be surprised where people fall. You might be surprised where your champions lie in your organization for change. And that's why it's starting with talking to people and understanding where they're coming from. There is a kind of a model in your in here that you can kind of use and jot down, or there was at one point. Oh yeah, it's on page 18. There's a stakeholder mapping tool. So it's what's your goal, who are the important stakeholders, and then where do you think they sit right now, and how do you move them along? And I'll do an example of what this might look like. So maybe in the scenario we used, how one of the solutions, one of the practice changes might be to share more information on the website about what they're doing. And so you might have you might think that your younger board members and the executive director might be key allies in that they understand the importance of the internet and the web and sharing information. Your grants manager would be a big fan of this too, high influence, high support. These are the people that are already your champions. You might have people that are high influence but low support, older board members, other staff, and those are the people that you need to do some advocacy with to see if you can get them to support the idea to share more information on the website. You may have people that have high support, like the grantees who want more information, but they have low influence. They're not going to be able to help change the practice in your organization. But can you mobilize them? Those might be people you can mobilize to tell their stories to some of the high influence, low support people. And that's one of the levers you could pull, is putting a human face on some of the problems. We'll talk about that in a minute. And your web developer, maybe the person that's actually going to make the change, that's an example of someone that might be low support, low influence. That's a marginal player in it. So this is an example of how you might do stakeholder mapping. Again, what you want to do is not make assumptions about older board members and younger board members, but actually talk to the board members. Like I said, you might have surprise champions in your organization that then you can help mobilize. And mobilize your allies to work with you to change and influence the low support, high influence group of people. Does that make sense? So it's really kind of having a thoughtful, strategic approach to how are you going to get these people to become champions for change or be comfortable for change. And then how do you actually get them to move and come along with you? So this idea of moving from positions to interests is getting below what people say they want to why they want what they want. And key questions to ask your colleagues is, why is something important to you and what's most important to them? So there's some key questions to ask when you're trying to move people from positions to interests. And I have an example of how to do this. So one of the big conversations in the field is one-year, multi-year grants. So let's say your board's pretty comfortable with the one-year grants and staff really wants multi-year grants. And so you think about it like an iceberg. So the position is what's showing, it's the part that's showing above the water. And if the board wants one-year grants and staff want multi-year grants, one-year grant, multi-year grant, 1 year, where does that conversation go? That conversation can't go anywhere it's a non-starter. You can keep butting heads on it all you want. What you have to do is get below that surface to the interests. So staff want to move beyond outputs to outcomes. They want longer term grants so they can see and have influence on what's happening. They want to focus their time on learning and not just processing grant applications. And they want to reduce the application burden on their grant seekers and grantees. Those are all great things. The board wants to keep grantees accountable. If we've already made the multi-year commitment, how do we know they're going to be as energized to achieve? What if we overcommit our funds and something happens in the market and now we're dipping into the endowment where we've overextended ourselves? We've never done it before. This is the way we've always done it. We've always done single-year grants. And we're, this kind of gets back to the endowment. We want to have enough money for new stuff. If we commit all of our funds to multi-year grants, what if brand new ideas come along and we're not able to take advantage of them? So those are all, so now you can have a conversation. So now this comes into the question, what of all of this is most important to staff? What of all of this is most important to the board? And now you can have a conversation, because maybe what's most important to staff is reducing the grantee burden, and what's most important to the board is minimizing the foundation's financial risk. Well, now that's a whole different conversation, and a conversation you can have and work through and brainstorm solutions. Longer term grants for certain things. Really put contingencies on those grant funds based on performance. Put contingencies on those grant funds based on what's happening with the foundation's endowment. Reducing the burden. Maybe we just need less reporting requirements to help our grantees. There could be more and more ideas. So now you can see how this one-year, multi-year grant conversation that went nowhere now can actually get some movement and get some change going, because you're moving into the interests of the two people involved. Does that make sense? And then you have to decide what you actually want to do from the brainstorming together. And part of this is really talking to each other, and sometimes that's hard. And so there's this whole area of courageous conversations, difficult conversations. How many people here have been through training on how to have difficult conversations? It's a tough thing to do, because it's messy, people are messy. And it's a mix of what I consider to be, and then this is hard to talk about in this day and age, what I consider facts might not be what you consider facts. But both of us are right. We have different perceptions and different ways that we see the world. We have different values and beliefs, and there's messy emotions that are tied up in all of this. And having courageous conversations means dealing with all of it. So here's an example of how perceptions are different. So there's a small town, has 2 newspapers. The headline on one is "Overbearing Forest Residents Terrorize Lost Girl, Force Her to Abandon Temporary Shelter." The headline in the other paper, "Juvenile Delinquent Breaks into Absent Family's Home, Steals Food, Wantonly Destroys Furniture." Do you know this story? What is it? Goldilocks. Both things are right, depending on your perception. And so that goes back to inquiry before advocacy and understanding the other person's perception and respecting it, that they do have a valid point of view from where they're coming from, and you need to understand and join that. So it's going back to that cultivating curiosity, balancing inquiry, advocacy with plenty of inquiry. Acknowledging the emotions, values, and identity. It's so important to say to someone, hey, I see that this idea of changing this practice, that it's making you uncomfortable. Let's talk about that. Why does it make you feel uncomfortable? And trying to unpack, understanding if what you're seeing in the other person's emotion is actually what they're feeling, and why are they feeling that way? Are they nervous about losing their job? Well, if we don't do our work the same way anymore, what do I do? So it's trying to unpack and understand where people's emotions are coming from. And acknowledging other people's perceptions, acknowledging other people's emotions doesn't mean agreeing with them. It means that you are listening to them, and that you are seeking understanding of values and identity. So how do you actually make the case? Okay, 7 minutes. Okay. And so we found philanthropy is tough, changing practices is tough. There are no outside forces that are making you change your practices. It has to come from within. It has to come from champions within your organizations making it happen. So it's not like a corporation who's trying to maximize profits, and so they're going to try to do everything they can to reduce their costs to make that happen. We don't have that same kind of environment in the work that we do. And so we found that there's just 4 levers that will influence change in an organization. And values is certainly one of them. And so it's coming back to here's who we think we are as an organization, and therefore we should act in that way to be authentic out there in the world, to be who we want to be. The human face. So because we're doing our practices this way, here is the real impact we're having on our grant seekers, our grantees, on the communities that we're serving. That can come through feedback from grant seekers and grantees. How many people survey their grant seekers and grantees about your practices? What do they think about? Excellent. And taking that back in and using that data to say this has a real impact, that there is a real cost to the requirements that we put on grantees and grant seekers. And don't we have a responsibility to try to reduce that and make that as small as possible? For example, cost could be a factor. If we change our practices, then we will use less resources in our grant making. If we change our practices, grantees can spend more time on their mission, less time on administration and paperwork for us. So some people, particularly like the COO, CFO roles, really respond to cost arguments in that. We're working on a cost calculator that's for grant makers as well as grant seekers. We should have it out early next year. That will allow you to go in and say, here's our practices, and it will tell you how much it's costing you to make a grant. And suggest ways that you could reduce that in your organization and give you guides and tools to help you do that. Grant seekers can also use it and put in the requirements of a funder and calculate how much it's going to cost them to go after that money so they can decide whether it's worth it or not. So I think it'll be a good benefit on both sides on that. And then benchmarking. Everybody else is doing it this way, we should too. So effective practices, best practices, and that's certainly an area we have a lot of research and information on, but also people in the room, talking to your colleagues, talking to, kind of what are the norms and ways that New Jersey grant makers are doing their grant making might be an effective argument to make change happen in your organization. Has anybody else used any other, I'm always looking for new tools, tactics, ways to make the case for change in your organization? Nobody's come up with a new one? Yes.
Well, I don't know whether I want to specifically respond to that, but and I don't know the composition of the room here, but I think I can speak to it from the standpoint of it being an educated process, and that it has to be, again, all of you are employees. I wonder how many board.
Oh, sure. How many board members do we have? And how many staff members do we have? Perfect.
Okay,
Yes.
That's exactly my point.
Yeah.
Because how do you transmit this kind of information back to the board?
Mm-hmm.
That is such an important part. There's got to be essentially the dialogue between the executive director of the foundation, between the board chair, but beyond that also to the board members. And how do you've given us an awful lot to digest.
Yep.
It's important. How do you get that back to the board members? Identify, which board member may be the one to talk to. But this has to be handled very diplomatically, as I think you said.
Yep.
But that is the crux of the matter. How do you, if you're an executive director, you've got to go to the board and say, I need to hear from you. What policies do you need from the board?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, do we do a good job of that?
So we're hearing from the perspective, for those of you maybe that in the back, so we're hearing from a board member saying this is kind of tough, and how does staff manage up? How does staff bring all of this great information and get the board on board, how do you know where the individual board, or let me know if I'm paraphrasing wrong, how do you know where the individual board members are in their thinking, and how do you meet them where they are? How do you handle this in a respectful, diplomatic way? It's not easy stuff. I would go back to thinking about this as a very incremental change kind of process. Not, I think maybe if you try to tackle everything all at once, you might overwhelm people a little bit. So it comes from the relationships that you have in your organization and just talking to each other. So it's not it's time more than any kind of specific expertise or knowledge. Time and conversation. So I think that was a great point in terms of kind of how does the board get on board with this. Do you have any ideas for what's effective in reaching the board and making a case for change?
Getting this stuff back to the board.
Yeah. Yep.
Ask them.
Yep.
Ask board members, what do you want? What do you
Yep.
The same kinds of questions that you're asking us.
Yep.
Is very important. And I think that, if the board can, I don't, obviously, you don't want to throw back all this information on
Yeah.
that doesn't work. But if, as you said, incrementally, you get these points across, and you may go through a selected board member, or you may ask, what do you as a board member think about this? How are we going to, you need change, how are we going to change? If we don't want change, are we really accomplishing what we want to? And that also reflects on the board member himself in that there's a sense that they're involved in the whole process.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't know if I can paraphrase that. That was so kind of well said. So, thank you. Well, it's being videotaped, so we can share that with you. I think I'm out of time now, I believe. I don't want to hold anything up. So thank you guys so much. Again, reach out to me if we can provide any more information. All this stuff and more is available through workbooks and articles and things that you can use with your boards, with your staff on your website. So hopefully we've left you with a lot of good information.
And they say you should always leave people wanting more, and I think you did that, which is great. You gave us a lot of, not just information.